Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Arsenal Pass. Today, I'm joined by Brodie Spurlock to go over a Briar deck tech. Brodie's a pretty interesting player over the past year, has sort of surged onto the scene. A local player of mine, known him for a while, but as of recently, seen him on the Battle Hardened circuit, just dominating people, obviously putting up big performances at things like US Nationals, Worlds, just an all around star player right now. And someone to look out for on the scene. We are going to be going over Briar. Briar's in an interesting spot. Prior to Worlds, I would say the hero was very underrated by most of the US players going to that tournament. At PT Lille, it was by far the best deck and most popular deck. But with the living legend of Prism, we did see it sort of fade. And we saw some players get punished for that weren't totally prepared for it at the World Championship. So Briar's back on the menu. A couple top eights in the World Championship, great performances. Uh, Brodie, how do you feel about the deck right now, post Worlds, and now in this Dynasty meta, just in general? Do you think has it gotten more powerful? Is the meta more favorable? And do you think that once again, maybe people in the United States are underappreciating this deck?
I think Briar's definitely still a strong pick. I don't think that Dynasty gave Briar that many new cards to work with outside of the what seems to be now maybe a popular head slot choice, Crown of Dominion with Royal Briar. I think that the Icelander matchup can be quite difficult for Briar to overcome. So that's the main thing holding her back right now, in my opinion. But I think she's still a strong pick for a tournament, and I would put her in the top 5 decks in the metagame.
Yeah. And you did mention Icelander there. I just want to quickly go over what kind of decks are you hoping to see when you bring Briar to a tournament. You talked about Icelander maybe being a deck you don't want to see. What decks are you preying on? And I also have to mention there was a recent result. I think it was I don't know if it was a ProQuest or it was just like a 1K or something. Arcane Games or something like that. The Ice Lexi did really well. That's what I'm getting to. Like Ice Lexi is maybe at the forefront of some people's minds right now, and I can't imagine that's a fantastic matchup for this deck. So what are you really looking to see in the meta when you bring something like Briar to the ProQuest?
In my opinion, Briar doesn't actually have any matchups that it just really crushes and hopes to prey upon. The reason I like the deck so much is it feels like it's just over 50% into most everything. So I would say it's a more well-rounded pick where you have game in every matchup, but there's no deck that I would consider a free win.
Mm-hmm. And are those ice decks generally pretty hard? Maybe Oldhim less, but Icelander and potentially Ice Lexi.
I think all three have quite a learning curve, and there's a lot you can do as a player to understand those decks and kind of overcome the challenges of the matchup. However, yes, Icelander and Ice Lexi can give Brair a really hard time. Like you said, I think Oldhim is a bit more manageable. From my experience into Lexi, once you've played a lot of reps against it and you kind of understand what turns you need to be willing to block out and then play a little bit more defensively and just look for one or two windows to try to smash face. I think the matchup can still be pretty close, but I would consider it unfavored.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, with that, let's go ahead and head into this deck tech. We're going to be talking about, everything that goes along with this deck, the cards inside of it, why we pick those cards, how to win with it, key play lines, et cetera, et cetera. All right, Brody. So I have the deck pulled up in front of us now. Why don't you just talk about like what is the core function of this deck? What are you trying to do sort of game to game?
So the most powerful card in the deck is Channel Mount Heroic, and the whole deck is sort of built around that. It consists almost entirely of cards that cost 0, aka Cheerios, and Channel Mount Heroic, which costs 3. So all of the blues in the deck are mostly there to support Channel Mount Heroic. A large majority of them are Earth cards, because I think the conclusion I've come to is outside of 2 cards, you don't really want a blue card in the deck unless it is there to support Channel Mount Heroic, because all of your reds cost 0, and you can get away with just playing more powerful reds. The two exceptions are Force of Nature, which is really just an incredibly powerful card. It can block 4 with an Embodiment of Earth. It is one of the strongest cards in some matchups or in some situations with the effect it provides, and it's really just a blue pitch as an added bonus on top of that. And the other exception is This Round's on Me. That card is another 4 block with an embodiment blue that is mostly there to tech against Fi. If you play This Round's on Me on turn 0 going first against Fi, It's remarkably powerful. It's kind of just like a free 4, sometimes 5, 6, maybe 7 damage, and it can also be nice later in the game. But yeah, outside of those two exceptions, you just play all of these zero cost reds and hope to draw about 1 blue per turn, because your first blue can be used to pitch the Grasp of the Arcanite to make a rune chant, and Rosetta Thorn to swing for 2 arcane and 2 physical. So the first blue is worth 5, and then outside of that 1 blue, you're hoping to draw all of these Cheerio reds, and the deck with a good mix of non-attack actions and attack actions is able to really take advantage of the like requirement on Rosetta Thorn to play
Mm.
both card types, and also Briar's ability. If you play multiple non-attack actions in a turn, you get an embodiment of lightning. You can use that to give a like powerful 0 for 4 attack go again. Like Snatch, for example, is one of the strongest, where a lot of times it's hard to play a big turn with that card without maybe just the one use of Snapdragon Scalers in other decks, or you're ending the chain with it. In Briar, you can play a couple pump non-attacks, use her hero ability to give Snatch go again, and then potentially draw more cards and continue with a bigger turn. But yeah, I would say the core game plan is to play really efficient zero cost cards, um, and ultimately use Channel Mount Heroic to go over the top. And I also wanted to mention that Briar is a deck that, because of Embodiment of Earth, actually is pretty decent at blocking. So a lot of times she plays kind of this mid-range back and forth game plan where she is blocking out while arsenaling to set up for bigger turns. And also sometimes you can play slow and just block 3 cards and attack with a 0 for 4, which is a if you have 3 blocks, that's a pretty solid rate to wait to find that Channel Mount Heroic. And yeah, that card is the main way you really get ahead of people.
Yeah, definitely. Rosetta Thorn and Snapdragon Sealers, like two of the equipment pieces of Briar, are so critical to the deck's overall strategy. Swinging Rosetta Thorn on the turn to turn just to get value out of your weapon because of how easy it is to satisfy the clause of non-attack action and attack action. Of course, Snapdragon Sealers being just a key equipment to go over the top on a big turn. Is there any matches or that you feel like you deviate from that game plan you talked about significantly, like potentially against something like fatigue, where you might run out of cards?
Yes. Versus Fatigue, I have 3 Sotomaro Blue in the deck as the main like card choice to counter that. And then you also play the game pretty differently. Versus Fatigue, you play even more of that kind of off-turn, big turn, off-turn, big turn, off-turn, big turn game plan, where you want to basically utilize it. The game no longer just becomes about winning turn cycles and utilizing the 4 cards in your hand each turn. It also it's key to manage the cards in your deck. So you have to be counting how many attack actions are left, and a lot of times there's some pitch stacking involved. So it becomes a bit more challenging to navigate certain decisions where otherwise you would just play a decent turn of like attacking for 10 damage. But if you spent 3 reds to attack for 10 damage that, for example, an Oldhim opponent can just block out, you didn't actually gain anything. So there's this weird balance where you kind of have to take off turns, maybe pitch 2 reds just to make a rune chant and set up a second cycle. I would say that is something, if you want to play Briar, that I would try to practice a lot. I don't think the fatigue strategy is as popular anymore, but it's definitely something to be prepared for because it is a very real threat.
Mhm. Well, let's sort of get into the core ratios here. Can you talk to me what you're striving for in a 60 card deck generally with Briar in terms of blues, reds, non-attack actions, attack actions? What ratios does this deck look to get in 60 cards?
Yeah, so I tend to stay at about 19 or 20 blues in a 60 in any given matchup, and 13 to 14 of those are usually earth cards, and 6 of them are those other 2 exceptions we talked about, Force of Nature and This Round's on Me. And as far as the sideboard blues, I have 21 total in the 80 cards, and that is mostly as tech for Icelander. So against her, you can go up to 21. So in the average matchup, I would play 19 blues and 41 reds. Uh, and as far as attacks versus non-attacks, I try to shoot for about 25 attack actions in at one time. I found that that is the best number to always have an attack or likely be able to find one off of Crown of Providence and avoid 4 or 5 non-attack action hands, which are very bad for the deck, but still draw a lot of pairs of non-attack actions in order to utilize that embodiment of Earth ability or embodiment of Lightning ability. Sorry.
Hmm.
Um, and I just wanted to note that's 25 red attack actions, not counting the 3 blue Autumn's Touch. So it's actually 28 total in the average 60.
Yeah. And in terms of engines with this deck, of course, we talked about Channel Mount Heroic, which is just the sort of the corner piece of it. But the ratios of your non-attack actions and attack actions are critical to the to part of the engine, which I believe is Rosetta Thorn. Right, you're gonna want to be able to satisfy that condition so you can swing the weapon and get value out of it on a turn by turn basis. There's just some cards I want to sort of dive directly into. Brodie, can you talk to me a little bit about the Sink Below? Sink Below being a defense reaction at red. What is the specific use case for it? And like, do you feel like it justifies putting it in the deck? Because obviously it has some ramifications, right? It's going to affect your Sonata Arcanix. It's not a great pitch card. It can be particularly rough against the ice decks if it happened to be in there, but I'm sure it wouldn't. But talk to me about Sink Below specifically, because I know this is a card that sometimes makes it in, sometimes doesn't. Some players are under the ideology that you always have it in your deck because it's so high value.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I've found that in Briar, that D-reacts in general are a very specific sideboard piece that I only bring in against Bravo and Dorinthia. And the reason that I only play them versus those two heroes is, like you mentioned, I think Sonata Arcanix is an incredibly powerful card. And running any card in the 60 that's not a non-attack or attack action will just inherently dilute your chances to hit on Sonata. So versus Bravo and Dorinthia in particular, the reason Sink Below is so powerful is because Bravo has these big dominated hit effects where if you have a Sink Below in Arsenal, you can gain oftentimes up to even 2 to 3 cards of value by stopping his crush when he dominates, or perhaps countering his pummel if it's a non-dominated attack where he pummels it to try to get crush through and discard trigger through.
Mm-hmm.
And Dorinthia plays this game plan where she sends in an attack, has some number of cards in hand, and you don't know whether they're attack reactions or not. So while it's sometimes correct to overblock, you oftentimes lose a lot of value by doing so. So it's a similar situation where having access to Sink Below lets you call her bluff, just block the normal amount, and then still block it out in the reaction step. Um, so those two matchups, I think there's a very particular reason why Sink Below is important.
Mm-hmm.
And versus everything else, I play Sonata Arcanix. Versus those two, I side out the 3 Sonata Arcanix. I also wanted to mention that Sigil of Suffering is another common defense react played in Briar. And I think that if you want to go for the plan of playing defense reactions into more matchups than just those particular two, Sigil tends to be better just because it can be a 0 for 5. On Sync's just always a 0 for 4. But I have found I like Sync more into those particular cases because all that matters is stopping the big on hits, and it's not worth it to me to take the risk that my opponent has a floating resource with which they can turn my defense react into just a 3 block and maybe still be able to push through that on hit effect.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about Coax of Commotion. This is a card that saw play in Briar initially and then kind of faded out of popularity. It's a bit of a skill intensive card, right? If it does hits, you need to know how to utilize what mode to choose and be able to take advantage of that. Can you give maybe some heuristics on how to best use Coax of Commotion, when to use which modes, or is it just completely contextual on the current game state?
It is definitely contextual, but there are some basic strategies I can tell. The main one is only use the draw a card mode if you know for sure that your card is more valuable than theirs, and that's pretty much only going to be the case on a Channel Mount Heroic turn. There are exceptions to that, but that's my heuristic, is just if I have Channel Mount Heroic and or sometimes Force of Nature in play, especially if I have both, but sometimes just Force of Nature, I will draw an extra card because I know that if it's an attack action, I gain so much value from that.
Mhm.
And like oftentimes 7, where my opponent will only get 3, maybe 4 out of their card. Or sometimes there are situations where it's like a channel turn where I don't even have a blue yet. So I know that anything I draw at best it's going to be a 0 for 7, and at very worst it's going to be a blue, where I get to swing Rosetta plus Grasper Enchant for 5. So situations like that with Channel are where Coax really shines. The Quicken mode I use more often versus heroes that don't like to go wide at all, and especially anyone that doesn't play Enlightened Strike. You can be a lot more loose, or like you can create quickens a lot more without fear of getting punished by your opponent. However, I think almost every hero right now is playing Enlightened Strike, so even against ones that don't like to go very wide, it is something to be mindful of. If you don't know for sure that you're going to get value out of your quicken, it might not be a good idea to give it to even like Oldhim or Icelander, because they can oftentimes utilize it with E-Strike.
Hmm. Definitely. So we talked previously, or talked before this, before you hopped onto this deck, and you mentioned that your sideboard strategy generally is to pull cards out of the quote unquote pile. Putting all the cards together and just taking out cards matchup to matchup. But you did come up with a short list for me of what a sideboard would look like if you were to have one. So let's go over that. You mentioned it was 3 Command and Conquer, 3 Runic Reclamation, 3 Exude, 1 Lightning Press, 3 Sink Below, and 1 Blues Captain's Call. You don't have to go into the specific matchups for each one, like what you're pulling them in for each matchup, but just tell me the general use case of those cards and why they are on the sideboard and what toolbox function they have.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about Sink Below. It's for Bravo and Dorinthia. Runic Reclamation is primarily for the Briar and for Icelander. It's a specific, you could call it a kind of hate card. Versus the Briar, it's mostly as a way to counter your opponent's Channel Mount heroic turn, and even if it never blows up a Channel Mount, it's such a big attack that requires them to block with some of their hand when they have a channel in play. So you kind of like at least halfway take away what would have been a power turn from them. And then against Icelander, it can be very nice if they have an Insidious Chill in play. Icelander is not usually fantastic at blocking breakpoints, with the exception of Sink Below and Brothers in Arms. So a lot of times, especially if they have an Insidious Chill with 2 or 3 counters, throwing a Runic Wreck at them is going to get a 3-card block, and that can be a really nice way to create advantage versus Icelander. I've also had several interesting scenarios where I end up with Channel Mount Heroic plus Runic Wreck in play, and a lot of times, if it's one attack first into a Runic Wreck, they simply can't block and they just lose their chill, plus you get a Rune Chant, so it can end up blowing them out as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the Runic Reclamation is funny. It also serves kind of a dual functionality against Icelander in the sense that Icelander will likely be prioritizing cards like Hypothermia against you, and if you do have a Runic Reclamation, it'd be quite good against that if you know it's coming, right? If it's maybe been revealed to an Aether Ice Vein, it's sort of the problem that that deck kind of has against Dash right now. It's either going wide or going tall, and it can do both quite well, right? It's hard for that deck to deal with. So we did go over sort of how to play the deck. I just want to sum it up, kind of tie it off with a little bow here. Can you just give us some heuristics on, playing the Briar deck effectively? Like some basic rules you probably adhere to most of your games.
Yeah, so versus aggro matchups, I think you should be looking to get full value out of a Channel Mount Heroic if you can. And sometimes if you have the option versus, for example, Fi, to either block 6 or 9 damage or present 6 or 9 damage, and there's not really a clear answer for, given like the current board state, a lot of times I prefer to block, because if the game goes longer, I tend to be advantaged. I have more time to find a Channel Mount Heroic. I only gets 1 use out of their Mask of the Pouncing Lynx. They also can find Art of War, which is a power card, but I think that Fi's real power spike is Art of War plus Mask of Pouncing Lynx, and Briar's is kind of just Channel Mount. So the game lasting more turns, in my opinion, will tend to favor Briar. Um, so that's kind of like one macro tip. Versus Oldhim and Ice decks in general, I kind of touched on this with Lexi, but I would recommend just blocking more. I think that a lot of times Oldhim will throw disruptive attacks, and it can feel like a lose-lose scenario. Like even if I block, they're gonna pummel me, or like even if I block just enough to stop the crush, I'm not gonna get a turn. And sometimes it's perfectly fine to just block with the 2-block attack and at least get 2 out of that card instead of ending up maybe getting 0, you know? Like, um, I think a very common play pattern versus Oldhim is just to block with preferably 3 non-attacks or maybe 2 non-attacks and an attack and just throw a 0 for 4, while you're kind of waiting to find a window to get a power turn. And then versus Icelander, I think this is like the hardest matchup, but it's similar advice. It's not quite block more, though I do recommend feeling comfortable blocking their physical attacks out. Um, I think it's a very careful balance of knowing what disruption they could have and playing around it the best you can, while also not playing scared the whole game, at least once or twice. I think the hard truth is you kind of have to go for it and maybe give them a window to blow you out with a hypothermia in some games, because if you don't do that and you just keep playing this safe game, a lot of times health totals get whittled down and then it just ends up always falling in Icelander's favor. So ideally you can set up your big turn to play around disruption the best as possible, but I think sometimes you just have to jam a channel out heroic and go for it, hope all they have is a frostbite, and try to get ahead that way. So that's my main tip versus Icelander, honestly, is just don't play too scared.
Yeah. And calling back to one of our matches at the Battle Hardened here in Dallas, I know that Bravo has gotten a little bit more popular in the meta. And one of the reasons why this deck is so good against Bravo is because it can block a lot with the armor. So between Crown of Providence, Grasp of the Arcanine, Findel Spring Tunic, or Aether Ironweave, whatever you're running, with a card from hand, you can block out pretty much any on hit effect from Bravo, including Crippling Crush that is not pummeled, right? So if it's dominated, this gives Briar just like this fantastic almost pivot on a stick, because Bravo will actually often have to take a lot of damage to commit something like a Crippling Crush to you, which is like their ultimate disruption. And you just have sitting there as a permanent on the board ready to go. It's just deny your crush effect. So strong. And I remember one of our games that was sort of how it went. You had the full armor block, came back with this just massive Channel Mount Heroic turn, and yeah, the deck seems quite good against Bravo. Let's talk about the future of the deck here. Just I know that this list is pretty refined at this point, right? Briar's been around for a long time, and you've had a lot of success with this list specifically. But if you could make any changes to would there be any cards you could potentially change in the deck? And I think the last thing I want to ask you to is just Snapdragon Scalers versus something like the other Runeblade boots. Sorry, they're running
Spellbound Creepers.
Spellbound Creepers. Yeah, they're sorry, it's on the tip of my tongue. But yeah, the Spellbound Creepers versus Snapdragon Scalers. Would you ever consider potentially trying out the Creepers?
Okay. Yeah, I'll start with potential other future cards. The main one for me is the Crown of Dominion Royal Briar build.
Mm.
I have not experimented too much with it myself. I think it's definitely something to keep looking into. I don't think that fully going that route and cutting Crown of Providence from the deck entirely is the right play, because there are some matchups where the extra armor is really important and it will end up being worth more than the one extra card, even on a big turn, is how I feel right now. But I do think that in some aggro matches, it could be the right play to go with the Royal build, try to get a Channel Out Heroic plus trade in turn set up together and like really pop off and overpower your opponent. I can't speak much to which one is better or like which matchups exactly you should play that in, because like I said, I have not tested it very much. But that's my main recommendation for anyone looking to kind of improve the deck, tweak it for the future. And then as far as the Snapdragon versus Spellbound Creepers debate, I think both cards are very powerful. Um, in a vacuum, I think Spellbound Creepers is definitely a better card. Like, it can give you 2 to 3 to sometimes even 4 if you get crazy lucky action points in the same game. Um, and it has a lot more utility with flashing in things like Channel Mount Heroic on a snatch to blow out your opponent, or flashing in a Force of Nature and doing these like quote unquote combat trick type plays. However, I've found that in this build of like the 0 for 4s Cheerio Briar, not having to pay a resource for snaps is immensely important. and you don't really know when you're going to get hands that need that extra action point. So even though creepers can be utilized multiple times per game, I've found very often that the 3 times I would have used it are like turns 2, 4, and 7, for example, and it's hard to keep it alive that long, and it might die on the turns in between, versus something like Viscerai or especially Chain, where it's easier to just chain multiple creepers uses in a row. And for those reasons, I have decided that Snapdragons is the one I prefer. I think especially in some matchups where you are taxed more, or the opponent blocks Arcane and it's less likely to keep creepers around, I think Snaps is definitely better, not having to pay the one resource. There are also some situations where you can't actually get away with playing non-attack after your attack, like if it's a Nimblism, for example. If your hand is Nimblism, and Twine Lightning unfused, then you aren't able to creep in the Nimblism and use it for full effect because there is no attack debuff. So those are kind of my main reasons why I prefer Snaps, but I would encourage people to try both and continue experimenting because Creepers is a very powerful card.
Yeah, definitely. Just a funny anecdote on my side was at Pro Tour number 2, both of my teammates played the Spellbound Creeper version. I actually played this version, the Snaps version, because it was so streamlined and just so fundamentally powerful. I didn't felt like I may have not had the reps of the confidence in the Spellbound Creepers list. It's a completely different list, by the way. It's you'll be running things like amulets. You have potentially more blues, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're looking to pick up this Briar deck and you want to figure out how you can tweak it or play it differently, like the Royal build that has starting to rise in popularity, that's a good thing to explore, as well as the Spellbound Creepers. But yeah, Brodie, thank you so much for coming on. I am 100% with you in believing that Briar is one of the top decks. Somehow always falls under the radar after Pro Tour number 2. It's crazy, but surely people will eventually sort of wake up to it as it keeps dominating these tournaments over and over again. Of course, until it gets Living Legend. But yeah, Brodie, thanks so much for coming on. Brodie did write an additional sideboard write up for us and piece for us with a few extra tips and tricks. A document that is going to be up on the Arsenal Pass Patreon. So if you're interested in that, check it out. The link will be in the description below. But yeah, Brodie, I look forward to seeing you at some ProQuest here in Texas after you get back from Jersey.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me on.